In our last video, we learned that the captain's own steward went mad and killed another sailor. We learned that his madness was somehow triggered after a strange beast they were carrying down to the lazarette for some reason lashed out and killed the cook, an event which cascaded into the deaths of many more sailors. They pulled this creature from a dinghy which contained more human corpses, and we recognized them as the kidnapped Formosans who disappeared during the murder chapter, and their kidnapper. It was at this point that the Unholy Captives chapter ended, and even though we're still inside a memory, we can use the memento mortem to activate a memory leading to the next chapter. And it's the body of second mate Nichols, the man who murdered Pasqua and framed Hok Seng Lao for it, the man we saw kidnapping Miss Lim. And the ghostly trail places the body, now to explore the memory.
Ahoy!
Well, back! Get the captain!
Ahoy!
The copper's aboard!
Wait! Don't shoot!
Avast!
I have treasure! I yield!
Hold your fire!
Oh, and he gets shot through the heart. But by whom? They were told to hold their fire. And at last we see where the beasts came from. Nichols returned to the Obra Dinn with at least one in the dinghy. And behind him we find the body of one of the missing Formosans with the chest that Nichols tried to steal from the passenger store. Nichols was towing another rowboat, and this one is littered with bodies. The body of Miss Lim, and the bodies of a few more beasts. But are they bodies? Could they still be alive? One must have been. In our last video, one managed to kill several crew members. Heading towards the Obra Dinn, we see the man responsible for killing second mate Nichols. It's one of the Formosan guards. Now we know why the captain had him taken prisoner and was interrogating him in our last video. He wanted to know why he killed second mate Nichols. And we know exactly why he did it too. Revenge. Remember, it was Nichols who murdered Pasqua and then framed Hok Seng Lao for it, allowing him to be executed. This Formosan guard must have known, and he wanted justice. Then we see another man in an officer's uniform peering out of a window. We see a few of the crew members we saw in our last episode on the deck, but it's then that the memory fades. Chapter 4, The Calling, Part 6, Off the Port Side. We identified the victim early on because Pasqua identified him by name. We know this is second mate Edward Nichols. And now we know how he died. He was shot with a gun. But we don't know by whom. I mean, we do know by whom. He's the Formosan guard who died in our last video, but we don't have enough information yet to deduce his identity. Taking a look at the sketch, we find a face that has been blurry up to this point, but now it's clear. What new information did we get in this part that allows us to identify him? Back on the sea, we can look up at the window that this man is looking through. Then, while standing before it, we can take a look at the ship's plans. We see that we are standing just outside the purser's office. Now we know that the purser's office is on the orlop deck, a deck which has no windows. To find windows, we have to go up one deck to the gun deck. And it is on the gun deck at this exact spot that we find a cabin with a window. This is the fourth mate's cabin. So the dinghy arrives in the dead of night while the officers are sleeping. A gunshot rings out. This man springs from his bed to peer out the window to see what was going on. If he was sleeping in this room, that must mean that this is the fourth mate, John Davies. This information now allows us to identify his steward. Time and time again, when we see the fourth mate, he is accompanied by a young man in a steward's uniform. Most recently in Chapter 6, Soldiers of the Sea, Part 3. In that episode, we found him trying to fight the wraiths riding the giant crabs, accompanied by what must be his steward. They were standing together again during the unjust execution of Hokseng Lao in Chapter 3, Murder, Part 2. Which is why we find this young man standing next to fourth mate John Davies in the Justice at Sea sketch, which was drawn during the execution. We can therefore, with confidence, identify him as Davy James, the fourth mate's steward. And we know his fate. He was the final person fleeing the ship with Henry Evans, Emily Jackson, and Miss Jane Bird in Chapter 9, Escape, Part 3. Which makes perfect sense, as his boss, the fourth mate, was murdered by Henry Brennan in the same chapter, just a few pages before. So, we can say that he's alive in Africa. For that, as we already know, ended up being their destination. Well done. 3 more fates correct. All right, making good progress. This leaves only one steward left, whom we can now identify through a process of elimination. Samuel Galligan, the second mate steward. We can easily pick him out in the Justice at Sea sketch. He wears a steward's uniform and stands with many of the other stewards. And as the second mate steward, we find him in many other scenes alongside second mate Edward Nichols. He stands next to Nichols during the execution of Hokseng Lao, and he appears to be in on the scheme. He whispers something into the ear of Edward Nichols, and Edward Nichols wears a smirk while the captain executes a man he knows is innocent. And we see him again in Chapter 3, Murder, Part 3, during the kidnapping of the Formosans. While second mate Edward Nichols is dragging away Miss Lim, the second mate steward is standing on a railing near to one of the dinghies that they stole. We can therefore identify this man as Samuel Galligan, the second mate steward from Ireland. But we do not yet know how he died. However, we saw him boarding the dinghies alongside Edward Nichols, but we didn't see his body in any of the dinghies upon their return, which means he must have been lost at sea. We'll press on to find out for sure. When ready, we can activate the memento mortem. And it's the body of one of the Formosans, lying in Edward Nichols' dinghy. He gasps his last breath with his arm on fire. Flame pours out of the chest, and he calls to Miss Lim, who does not respond. We see Edward Nichols struggling with one of the beasts. Oh, wait a minute. No, it looks like he's dragging it into the dinghy. We see that the other dinghy has been pulled alongside, and in it is another creature. No, 2 other creatures. And now that we get a better look at these creatures, we realize that they're mermaids. But why are they wounded? And in this same dinghy we find the body of Miss Lim. And then we see it shimmering by the head of one of these creatures. Well, it looks exactly like that shell that we saw in the Formosan's chest. Heading back over to the chest, Well, look at that. The drawer is open and the shell is still inside. Does that mean this shell came from one of these mermaids? But before we can explore further, the memory fades. Part 5, On the Open Sea. This man's face is still blurry. We know he's one of the Formosans, but we still don't have enough information to deduce his identity. And I guess we know how he died. We saw his arm on fire, and in our last episode, when we saw his body on board the Obra Dinn, we noted at the time that his entire right arm was skeletonized. The flesh had been burned off. We saw the flames spouting from the chest. We don't rightly know exactly what happened yet, but we can say with confidence that he burned to death. Back in the memory, we can look at Miss Lim. There's blood on her clothing and marks on her face and neck. One mermaid lies face down next to Miss Lim. Another one lies on her back, and we see it again, another glimmering shell in her hair. When ready, we can activate the memento mortem. And it's the body of Miss Lim. The mermaids shriek in agony, and each of them is struck with, oh, what is that? Some sort of fire or plasma or, I don't even know, energy bursts out of the chest. We see Miss Lim lying here, and the claw marks on her face become even more apparent. But lying next to her is another body, whose face is unknown to us. We haven't yet identified him. And then next to him, cowering in the back of the boat, is of course none other than Edward Nichols. The boats are surrounded by mermaids. This one, being struck with the bolt of energy, has a glimmering shell in her hair. This arc of energy appears to be hitting the sea, or perhaps it had targeted a mermaid that dove just in the nick of time. And then this one, the third and final mermaid, wrenches backwards in agony. Then, the man whose voice we heard, our Formosan, he flipped open the chest and reached inside. Some power from within this chest burst forth to subdue his attackers. In his dinghy, we find more corpses. Aha! Samuel Galligan. He did die out at sea, and there's a knife in his neck. So he wasn't killed by the mermaids. And next to him, the body of Li Hong, one of our Chinese topmen. But before we can explore further, the memory fades. Part 4, On the Open Sea. We identified her during the execution of Hok Sang Lao. She was again at that time addressed by name, Miss Lim. In this scene, she dies, but we don't really see how she died. I mean, we saw those claw marks on her face and the blood on her clothing, but that doesn't paint the whole picture for us. So instead of writing anything down just yet, we'll go ahead and activate the next memory. And it's our Irish steward.
Oh, you still breathing? Can you row? Nichols, sir, shoot them for God's sake!
Samuel dies while struggling with our heroic Formosan. he stabs Samuel in the neck with a knife, the same knife we saw in the last memory. Moving to the next boat, one of the men is about to fall overboard. Alexei Toporov, the Russian with the tobacco pipe. We see his pipe flying. Next to him, we see our currently unknown sailor with a spear lodged in his neck. And at last, we see the death of Miss Lim. As a captive, her hands were bound behind her back, so she couldn't defend herself when a mermaid sprung from the sea and strangled her to death. And we see that those weren't claw marks on her face, they were bite marks. And Edward Nichols still cowers in his boat, while everyone else dies or fights around him. What a scumbag. Part 3. On the open sea. We identified him earlier thanks to his steward's uniform, and now we know how he died. He was knifed by our heroic Formosan, but since we don't know his name yet, we can't jot it down here. But now we know how Miss Lim died, so going back a page, we can record that she was strangled by a beast. Now a name was shouted out here, O'Hagan, but we don't know who that is yet. Perhaps we'll find out by exploring the next memory. And it's our mystery sailor.
Keep rowing!
Where is it? There! Something there!
I see it!
Give us a weapon! Shoot! My kid eye!
Pick up the oars and row, you fools!
Oh, nasty! One of the mermaids throws a spear through the neck of our unknown sailor, while Alexei Toporov looks on in horror. We heard the gunshot. Looks like Edward Nichols tried to fire at one, and sure enough, we see a mermaid diving just after the shot we heard. The mermaid who threw the spear is wearing one of those glimmering shells in her hair. We see Miss Lim cowering in the dinghy, her hands still tied, and we learn how our heroic Formosan freed himself. He cut the ropes that bound him using the point of a spear impaled through Li Hong. And here we find out what happened to Alarcus Nikishin. He was grabbed from behind by a mermaid who dug its claws into his chest and drags him into the sea to his death, while Samuel looks on in horror. But it is there that our memory ends. Part 2, on the open sea. This man's face, which has been blurry the entire game, is finally unblurred. We have two big clues as to his identity. The first is that we've already identified all non-Formosans who were part of this kidnapping plot. All but one. And the second is that in our last memory, Samuel addressed him by name.
O'Hagan, you still breathing? Can you row?
But of course, he got no response. And that's because O'Hagan had been speared through the neck by these mermaids. Therefore, since Samuel named him by name, and he's the only non-Formosan on these boats we have yet to identify, we can with confidence identify him as the final seaman we have not yet identified, Patrick O'Hagan from Ireland. And we know how he died. He was speared through the neck by a beast. And we heard another name, though it was in Formosan. Before she was strangled to death, Miss Lim gave Bang orders.
Where is it? There!
Bang the chest, she said. And what did we see in our last memory, which takes place just after this moment? Our heroic Formosan kills Samuel so that he can reach the chest. She knew what would happen if you were to open the chest. It was their only way out. He tells her to stay down while he's using the tip of a spear to cut the ropes that are binding him so that he can open the chest. We can now identify our heroic Formosan. The man who opened the chest is It Bang Sha from Formosa. Well done. 3 more fates correct. And now that we've finally identified him, we can complete the fate of Samuel Galligan. Remember, after Bang freed himself, he grabbed a knife and stabbed Samuel Galligan so that he could reach the chest. Therefore, Samuel Galligan, our Irish second mate steward, was knifed in the neck by It Bang Sha. When ready, we can activate the memento mortem. And it's Li Hong, speared through the chest.
Due east. You'll reach the Canaries in 3 days. You packed enough stores?
Aye, sir. Checked and loaded them myself.
Good. Stay quiet and alert. If the wind picks up, we've no chance against the Obra Dinn.
休假，你玩抓不？
我冇问题，但是伊嚟想啊，绝对袂当互伊落去水底。
那是遐个怪物出现，你绝对卖起来。
Aye, shut it up.
They say strange things about monsters.
Oh, and just as he was about to realize his own peril, a mermaid surfaces and throws a spear through his heart. We understand why Nichols brought Li Hong with him. He needed a translator so he could order the Formosans around. We see the mermaid who hefted that throw. She's a ways from the dinghy. That's quite an arm. And we see our cast of characters all alive, for this was the first death to happen to them after leaving the Obra Dinn. The conversation at the beginning was between Nichols and his mate, Samuel, each in their own dinghy. The other sailors here to row. Alarcus and O'Hagan were with Edward Nichols, and Alexi and Li Hong were with Samuel. But it's then the memory fades. Part 1. On the open sea. We identified Li Hong earlier when we identified the other Chinese sailors. We were able to do so using a process of elimination and by looking at the shoes that they wore. And now we know his fate. He was speared by a beast. And with this being the first and final memory in this chapter, we can make a few more conclusions. We have now identified every single Formosan but one. Taking a look at the manifest, the only one not identified is Chiao Tan. And there were only 4 of them. Hok Sang Lao was unjustly executed, and we saw Miss Lim and Bang die in this chapter. That means that the Formosan guard who was left aboard the Obra Dinn, the same one who shot Edward Nichols when he returned to the ship, must be the final Formosan on this manifest. And so we can flip through the book and identify him as Chiao Tan. Well done. 3 more fates correct. Now that we have identified him, we can finally seal the fate of Edward Nichols, the man who started all of this. He was shot in cold-blooded revenge by Chiao Tan. We hear a door open up at sea. After we've done all we can walk across the waves to return to the present. Six people died this chapter, and 2 vanished. 2 wayward souls disappeared during the events of this chapter. Their fates are cataloged here. The 2 disappearances are Alexei Toporov and Alarkus Nikishin. But we saw what happened to them. We saw Alexei Toporov falling into the sea along with his tobacco pipe. And we saw Alarkus Nikishin being dragged into the sea by a mermaid with its claws stabbed through his chest. And so we can seal these 2 fates, first, by recording that Alexei was drowned by a beast. Well done. 2 more fates correct. And then that Alarkus Nikishin was drowned by a beast. Now, the book said that we only got 2 fates correct last time, and yet it still baked them into the book. That must mean that the final fates in this book don't fit into our 3-fate rule. And having just solved Alarkus's fate, that means there's 1 fate left to go. The final fate is that of Olus Waiter, the gunner's mate. We recall that he was one of the mutineers, if not the mutineer, who was conspiring against the captain in Chapter 9, The Escape. He murdered the midshipman who had overheard the mutinous plot and was then killed for that murder by none other than 4th mate John Davies. As we've only just now identified John Davies, it is only now that we can finally seal this fate. And so we'll say that Olus Waiter was shot with a gun by 4th mate John Davies. Well done. All currently solvable fates correct. There is nothing left to do on the Obra Dinn.
Boy! In there somewhere! Storm's coming! Finish your business and climb down here!
After solving the final fate, a storm blows in. We see it beginning to rain aboard the deck of the Obra Dinn. A deck now littered with the ghostly visages of the men who died here. We now have to leave to complete our report and deliver it to the East India Company. We'll pick up right here where we leave off with the dramatic conclusion in our next episode. If you don't want to miss it, be sure to subscribe and to click that bell notification button. If you have and you still feel like you're missing out on YouTube notifications, consider following me on Twitter at Oxhorn. I update Twitter manually with every new piece of content that I publish. I've got a brand new shirt in the shop. No dice. That's right, it's everyone's favorite, or maybe infuriating, perfectly preserved pie. You can now celebrate your luck, or lack of it, with this brand new shirt. My shirts are available in a wide range of men's, women's, and children's sizes, and in a wide array of colors. You can find this design on other products as well, like smartphone cases, pillows, posters, mugs, stickers, prints, etc. So if interested, you can find a link to my shop in the description below, or you can click here. If you like what I do and you want to support me in a more personal way, consider becoming a patron on Patreon or a member here on YouTube. But more than anything, I'm just so glad you're here watching this video with me today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you soon with more brand new videos.